Colleagues and friends, this is Julie Finlayson speaking. I'm the Research Fellow at the Centre for Native Title Anthropology at the Australian National University. This is the third in a series of video and podcasts aimed at anthropologists working in the native title arena, with a focus on key concepts central to Aboriginal connections to country and the principles underlying those connections. The first one, presented by Professor Nick Peterson in conversation with Pascal Taplin, outlined the structures of classical local organisation, and the second, presented by Dr. John Morton in conversation with Carmen Cummings, focused on the fundamentally religious character of Aboriginal groups' connections to their country. This presentation is very much directed to particular issues facing anthropologists working on native title claims in the general region of Southeast Australia, and is presented through a dialogue between Dr. Paul Burke and Kim McCaul, both experienced practitioners in native title claims. By the southeast, Paul and Kim are meaning the general region from Adelaide across to the east coast and north up to the Queensland-New South Wales border. However, much, if not all, of their discussion would appear relevant to Queensland, at least south of Cape York. Aboriginal people across this region have a very long contact history and its associated dislocation from their lands and profound disruption to their societies at all levels. However, while the impacts of colonisation were felt by Aboriginal peoples across the whole of this vast area, diverse local and regional histories have resulted in differential impacts on the Aboriginal societies regionally. For this reason, Paul and Kim have necessarily kept their discussion at a fairly general level. They turn first to examining some of the impacts on Aboriginal societies across the southeast which pose challenges for meeting the requirements for establishing native title. These include, in particular, impacts on the nature of Aboriginal people's connections to country and on the laws and customs under which those connections arise. Central to their presentation is a consideration of the significance of what anthropologist Peter Sutton termed the families of polity to Aboriginal people's connections to country, and which Paul and Kim propose are a key mechanism through which distinctive Aboriginal laws and customs relevant to connections to country are established and transmitted. Enjoy.
Anyway, even though this is it's a big area and it's very varied in its local histories, but I've tried to pull out some what I see as the problematic features of native title claimant groups in this area, and in other areas where there's a long contact history. One of the main problematic things is the historic fragmentation and dispersal of the people, and this results sometimes in institutionalised conflict between groups, between Aboriginal groups, claimant groups. In Queensland, this is sometimes sort of institutionalised into conflicts between so-called historic people and who have been moved into an area versus the traditional people who are the owners going back a long way from the area. There's also sometimes disputes between people who have remained in a local area and their relations who return from some diaspora location. And in many circumstances, these sort of disputes between families revolve around the lucrative heritage clearance work, and so there's sometimes quite a bit at stake. But this sort of fragmentation and dispersal results in a attenuation or absence of the more classical traditions, the pre-contact traditions. So instead of those, we sometimes get, I've got 7 points here. I'll go through them quickly. One is there are more general ideas about traditional language areas, and sometimes traditional areas are extrapolated from the location of the last known or the earliest ancestor. It's often disputed about what the name of the area is, the traditional area, which language are associated with it. Sometimes there's disputes about resulting from different research that people have been doing. Second point, people's feelings towards their traditional country is often expressed at a fairly general sort of level, like as in people say we feel like we're at home when we're on our traditional country, or there's an openness to uncanny sort of events happening when they go to their traditional country, or other people say they feel the presence of the spirits of their ancestors. So those kinds of things, that's the sort of nature of the spiritual sort of relationship to the land. Third thing, groups are sometimes defined by cognatic descent from a recognized ancestor, sometimes with a strict approach to biological descent. Sometimes people speak of bloodlines, and there's sometimes exclude all adopted sort of people, all adopted descendants. Fourth thing, there persist ideas of eldership, which is not exactly the same as sort of traditional authority in the pre-contact, but it's similar. I would see in the pre-contact sort of authority more being in the field of traditional knowledge about esoteric sacred matters and the performance of rituals and knowledge about those things. But there is still ideas of eldership. People always talk about elders. And fifth thing, there's in some respects, there's although the details of kinship system sometimes is attenuated or not present, people sometimes use English kinship terms in a sort of traditional way. For example, mum for your mother, sister, and brother for cousin, those sort of things. 6, continuing importance of funerals and some ceremonies which may or may not be of recent origin. The smoking ceremony seems to have got a new lease of life at the moment, very, very popular as a purification ceremony on different occasions. People use it. Sometimes ceremonies for repatriation of returned skeletal remains, and there's sometimes people get called upon to perform welcome to country. But that's sort of typically the limit of those sort of contemporary rituals. Another problematic point, number 7, is that there's a pervasiveness of claimant research. In my experience, some of the claimants tend to be co-researchers and have amassed a fairly detailed archive of their own of research materials. Anyway, what all this adds up to is that typically there, in these claims in this area, there's some uncertainty about who constitutes the group, claimant group, uncertainty about boundaries, uncertainty about whether the contemporary practices add up to a sufficient body of laws and customs, and uncertainty about whether these practices have evolved from older traditions. So in those circumstances, my general approach is that there has to be a middle course here. I've met anthropologists who started out in the remote areas like me, who have gone to work in other places like Queensland, saying there's nothing here. What can we report? And I find that to be an extreme view. But I also think that a lot of the claimants, for obvious reasons, because they believe in the justice of their claim, think that every native title claim should win or should succeed. And I just can't see it in some cases. So I think as anthropologists, we have to try this middle course of finding out exactly what's there, what can be described as traditional laws and customs, and not selling people short on that, but having some sort of evaluation of whether things are likely to succeed. And that's why we've chosen to focus on Peter Sutton's idea of families of polity, because it's sort of a model for what might be there as a real social grouping. And it may be helpful to inquire into that, delve into that a bit more deeply, and see whether it's working in different situations. Anyway, before I ask Kim to outline Peter's idea, do you have any other introductory remarks?
No, I think I was going to comment on what you just commented at the end there, which is the tension between, and I think the Yorta case highlighted that really well with, in that case, not so much the anthropologist, but a judge who had, I guess, learnt about Aboriginal culture in remote Northern Territory and then came to hear the Yorta case, Justice Olney, and found it very hard, it seems, to recognise the sort of traditional culture that he was looking for, or he didn't see it there. And I do remember at that stage there was this real sense that there was not going to be any native title anywhere south of the Northern Territory. Like, essentially at that point, I think there was an overall belief that native title wasn't going to happen in the southeast if we use that area. And of course, since then there's been a lot of determinations, and I think there has been this middle ground. There's been middle ground found. I think some of the determinations are perhaps also just state governments that have adapted the way they respond to native title cases and that are happy to come to consent determinations. Yeah, that issue of anthropologists coming from that lens, on the one hand, coming from that Northern Territory lens or that remote Aboriginal cultural lens on the one hand, but on the other hand, also perhaps like the claimant groups, essentially just taking a position that, well, if these Aboriginal people generally come from this area, then they should be entitled to native title. I mean, that's also anthropologists sometimes who embrace that view. And while I don't think there's anything wrong with that, such a view in principle outside of the native title legal process, once you're in the legal process, then you do have to start working with evidence and meeting the legal criteria. And I guess that's what we're trying to talk to today. And where I find the families of polity concept to be really useful. And I'm looking forward to this because I noticed from the notes that you shared with me earlier on that we perhaps have slightly different approach or a different interpretation to the way Peter Sutton used that expressed that concept of families of polity. And even though I think at the end we might arrive at the same place, but I think there's some differences perhaps that will be good to discuss.
All right, let's get into it. What are families of polity?
Okay, so I thought the best way to deal with that is to really read out Sutton's definition. So in his book, Native Title Anthropology, Sutton describes a family of polity as, and I'm quoting, a cognatic descent group formed by those who share recognized descent from a particular ancestor or set of closely related ancestors, and who trace their links to such ancestors through either parent. They are kin groups of enduring and central importance to the conduct of Aboriginal business. They are families of polity in the sense that they form a major structural element of public life in Aboriginal society and do not belong merely to a domestic or private domain. They persist over long periods and thus have many recognised deceased members who are not merely remembered, but who continue to form powerful reference points in determining how their living descendants establish rights and interests in traditional forms of cultural property, including identification with country. So that's a core definition, and I think it'll be good to just touch on a few points there shortly. But one thing that then Peter later on, a few pages later on, goes on to elaborate on is precisely that these constructs are by necessity post-contact constructs, because they refer back to ancestors who would in a traditional context have no longer been remembered or named, and who have, as he says now, so I'm just quoting Sutton again, the names of these ancestors are perpetuated in a way that in the classical system no human being's name normally was, but they resemble some of the functions of the ancestral beings or founding clan dreamings of the older culture by becoming datum points from which living persons are joined by common descent and common country. And I guess the most common way, or a common way in which that expresses itself is if the highest known, the furthest remote known ancestor is identified in the documentary record as having been born or long-term resided at pastoral station X, then now we are 3, 4, 5 generations removed from this ancestor. The family often will emphasize that connection, and that station will become assumed to have been the ancestral country of that ancestor and all their descendants. So that is one aspect of that, which then in the reality and the practices of native title claims and politics and so on, of course, gets broken down into other levels that I think we'll touch on shortly. Did you want to add something to that, Paul?
The other aspects I think are important in this idea is that membership is by choice. There's a distinction, and this applies to all cognitive descent groups. There's probably a lot of descendants who are descended from an ancestor, but not all of them choose to be involved in the group. And in Sutton's formulation of this model, it's the people who choose to be in it. That's the critical thing about membership. The actual members of the group, not just the potential members. You have to choose to be involved in it. And the other thing, I suppose, is not the relationship between that and a language group. People who say we belong to this language area or language group, Sutton, that's very widespread, but Sutton is saying that the social reality is this smaller group, typically smaller group than a language group. It's a family who has these characteristics, and they refer to an ancestor, to an area of land, choose to be involved, and that the way he describes it is that the belonging to a family of polity, an Aboriginal family in this sense, is the way to legitimately belong to a broader language group, which may be a bit more amorphous socially. Anyway, and just a word about how he came up with this. This sort of model is derived from his reading of a lot of anthropological and other research in the southeast, as we've defined it, and so it's drawing a generalisation from that. Anyway, I'll move on to give my view of the pluses and minuses of that. But anything else we need to say about what families of polity are?
Well, I think the other aspect that's useful is there's often this reference to a key surname. And this surname is often, so if you have the original ancestor that's on record, give them the surname Brown, and they had 2 sons and a daughter. This person had 2 sons and a daughter, and they've got another 2 Browns that have kids with the Brown surname, and the daughter married a Green, and they have a Green, and so on. So at that level, you might have people who say, well, I'm a Green, but really I'm a Brown, because I go back to that ancestor. And of course, as you go down the generations, you might have this plethora of surnames today, but often people will reference back this, I'm this, but actually I'm that, at different levels. And I think that's a really important aspect, because especially when you talk about the more amorphous tribe, language group, under which we're often presented with originally with a native title claim, that can be quite, it seems like it's an entity, but when you start noticing these dynamics underneath, you realize that there are actually these multiple strands of family dynamics that are playing out, and they are playing out as this quote that I just read out said, it's in the public sphere, and it'll play out at community meetings where you'll have all the Browns sitting together and all the Smiths sitting together. It'll play out in voting, it'll play out in disputes, and so on, and things we'll touch on in a moment.
And I think that was one of the positive features of his theorising here, that it's grounded in ethnography of these areas, and this is the way you hear people speak, and without him drawing attention to it like this, it could easily be missed as just a surname, but it's used in a much a different way to describe this more stable group that goes back a long way. Notwithstanding the contemporary profusion of surnames. Anyway, perhaps we should move on then to the pluses and minuses. I'll kick off I think I've only got 3 points. One, I've already said the first one is that there are some limits to a generalised model like this for diverse sort of local circumstances. You really have to see whether it applies to a local circumstances, and there's perennial difficulties of the consultant anthropologist and in-house anthropologist getting enough time to actually do anthropological field work amongst native title holders just to see the way they talk and the way they interact, to observe these subtleties. But anyway, that's the first point. It's a general model that needs sort of local specification. Second point, I do wonder whether the families of polity are as self-sufficient and stable as Peter Sutton implies. And one of the things I think is inherently unstable is the focal ancestor. If you pick a focal ancestor who's way back, you get a big group. if you pick a focal ancestor who's closer to you, you get a much smaller, narrower group. And so I'd say there's an inherent instability in that idea that I don't think he goes far enough towards it, recognising. Anyway, third point, families of polity are obviously very important. And as you said to me in our previous discussions, they're the means by which most people in these areas find out about their traditions and their traditional country. But to say that there exists a family of polity doesn't replace the need to demonstrate contemporary traditional laws and customs, shared norms relating to land in the native title process. And I've sometimes come across reports that say, well, we've got this family of polity here. What more do we need to do to prove native title? And my answer is a lot. Anyway, how do you see the pluses and minuses of the families of polity?
Well, I would like to touch on that issue of the self-sufficient and stability issue, and I was curious about that because, and I had a look through Peter's book today, and I couldn't find the reference either for the stability really, but also I had in mind having actually seen him talking about the fission, right, that potentially happens as families of polity get really large, and then for a number of different reasons, whether it's political, whether it's geographic, that certain branches have, centered around a certain town and others somewhere else, that you have this natural splitting, which actually you would expect in terms of, especially once if the pressure of a native title claim is removed, right, that there's this attachment having to attach to a key ancestor, that people would go down in accordance with more classical principles to the grandparental generation, for example. And I've seen that in practice, and I think it works, especially where the grandparental level, for example, still offers solid grounds for connection. So, for example, if the grandparent was born on country and maybe grew up on country, then I've certainly seen that their grandchildren, rather than go 2 levels up, start talking about that grandparent as we're all that, as whatever the name might be of that grandparent. And I think they have to be dynamic, like you said. I think they are social structures with many different pressures on them. And as you also said, and I've said that in reports, right, that I don't have capacity. We don't have scope to do a proper ethnography of the families of polity. That would be ideal. And I actually was just quickly looking up, and if I find it, I'll add it in. There is a book written by the University of Queensland anthropologist, whose name I can't remember right now, about a Queensland community, which was an excellent it was sort of an excellent review of the nuances of the different family structures and family lives there. And that is not something that we can do in a native title report. So it'll always be limited, but I do think that they provide a really key entry point to unpicking community dynamics and identifying patterns of intergroup relationship and connections to country. And especially when there is contestation or an overlap, I think it can be really helpful to start looking at the level of the families involved rather than the level of language groups. So often people say, oh, there's an overlap between X and Y. What's going on here? But as you drill down, you might find that actually it's only particular family from X that's involved, and they actually also have really close links to another family in Y, and it's at that level that really the issues are arising. And so I think that's a really useful analytical tool.
Yeah, no, well, I think we agree on that point, that the scale that he's pointing to is the right scale. The family, the extended family group, this cognitive group. You can't go, even if people talk about language groups or language identity, like tribes, there's no point going looking for that initially. The things, and this is, I think, he's where he's on the right track. And you notice when organisations are big, or when claimant groups are big, there is this tendency to split into smaller groupings, and typically that's along the lines of these what Sutton calls families of polities. There's family groupings. So I think he's right there. Yeah, I think you were going to give us an example from your experience of where you found that this idea of the families of polity was helpful in working with a group who had a difficult native title claim in the southwest somewhere.
Yeah. So I'm going to keep it anonymous because that claim is completed and ended in a positive consent determination for the claimants, but there's a new claim now by the same group. It was almost like a textbook, like it kind of matched almost word for word the way Peter writes about it in his book. Like he gives this example of we referred to it already, of these multiple layers of, we are Smiths, but we're really Greens, going back to that level, or we are this, but we're really that, and we're actually all one together with that mob under this other umbrella. The sort of accounts that he gives in his book. And it was almost as if some of the claimants I worked with had read those passages, right? That's how, because it was, but of course it was people like, they were the ones who would have informed Peter in formulating, not those individuals, but that sort of discourse. And so when I took on that case, a lot of people were really skeptical about its chances of success, and even my ability to work with the group, because there'd been some really bitter fighting and intergroup conflict, which seemed to bamboozle everybody who dealt with the group, because they didn't really understand what was happening there. And so in that context, it just emerged very naturally, in the way people spoke about their families, like I just said. There was a really clear definition, association between ancestors and particular areas of land within the claim area. So people kind of used the families in a little bit as a evolved clan concept, you could say, because there was this idea of descent to usually by reference to pastoral stations, in a couple of cases to a couple of key sites. And all descendants were said, well, we all belong to that place because of great-great-grandparent such and such, and that was their place. It really helped me thinking about the whole issue in terms of the families and the family of polity. Really helped me understand the community politics and to see how people's loyalties were bound to particular groups, at times even when people clearly knew that what perhaps some of the key agitators, because of course it wasn't, the disputes really were just a few individuals in each of these families. It wasn't like the whole families were necessarily in dispute, but people nonetheless had loyalty to their family as opposed to the bigger group. And one of the key ways in which the dispute took place was by denying the validity of the other family. So essentially, there was many accusations of such and such a family, they don't even belong here, their ancestor came from somewhere else, usually far away, and completely, like, it was clear that that was not the case, and everybody would have known that that wasn't really the case, but that was the way it was expressed, to deny relationship and to deny common ancestry in terms of connection to the country. So what I found in that case was kind of four key points that I thought were really useful to illustrate the continuity of a system of law and custom. The first one is that we already touched on, is that the transmission of laws and customs were within the family of polity. So most people received both information and about the country and about their traditions, as well as experience on country and on country visits, learning about sites and so on, from members of their own family of polity rather than from any other family. And in fact, there was a lot of emphasis on not sharing information across family, which potentially raises an issue, right? And we can think about it as a system of law and custom that could actually be problematic if they're sort of hermetically sealed, which of course they aren't really, but that is the discourse. Similarly, there was a policing of laws and customs across families of polity. So it was much more likely for people to comment on perceived breaches of law and custom by others, from members from other families rather than their own. It wasn't always the case. Sometimes people would pick up their own relatives, or let's say often there was people with relatives across the families, but their own members of their own family of polity. But much more commonly, there was a lot of identifying wrongdoing by other members of family of polity, which highlighted normative behaviour. It highlighted the sense of what needs to happen, what should happen, and also often what happens if you breach this behaviour, which was a mix of kind of the spiritual consequences of getting sick, having accidents, having a flat tire, being chased by whirlwinds, that sort of thing, and potentially also physical hostility in the group. And then this thing I already touched on is the focus on particular areas of country by particular families of polity, and arguably the continuity of highly evolved, but nonetheless some continuity of the estate system. So I thought it was a really important aspect to unpicking, and patterns of behaviour, patterns of beliefs, and underlying patterns. I would argue patterns point to normativity.
What I thought I'd do is in more of a contrast to families of polity, is to look at some formulations of contemporary traditional laws and customs I came up with based on southern Queensland experience, and contrast that with families of polity. The 7 rules. 1, only claim rights to your own traditional country. Everyone agrees to that. 2, country rights derived from descent from the original owners. No problem. 3, and this is the often disputed one, if you have multiple traditional countries you could choose, you should focus on one primary traditional country. This is, in a situation I was involved in, very problematic. One group fervently held to this rule, you should have one primary traditional country. Other group, other family, not so much. And so almost an impasse. Anyway, number 4.
Was this families within the same, was this from within the same claim group, or was this across 2 claim groups? Or
This was a claim group consisting of a number of families. Yeah. And I was trying to work out, what their shared norms might be, their shared laws and customs. Decisions relating to the traditional country should be made by the elders and they should be respected. 5, cultural heritage sites on the country should be protected. 6, the appearance and resources of the country should be protected. This is the sort of very common care for country, looking after country sort of norm, which I think is a real thing amongst these people. Number 7, the younger generation should be taught about the country. And part of the reason for developing these sort of explicit norms, which sometimes don't necessarily occur to people who are sort of living them, is to provide a basis for getting more ethnographic information about the reality of norms, and if they're not followed, what happens, and who doesn't speak to them at the next family gathering, or who casts aspersions or starts talking behind their back, those sorts of things. Having such a list doesn't necessarily solve problems of boundaries or group membership. They are always difficult to resolve. But that it does demonstrate that I think the families of polity idea only gets you so far as a sort of a preliminary step. It does help in understanding in the ways that you've set out quite well, I think, the dynamics, the typical dynamics between families. Anyway, perhaps we should try and tie it all up and just recap on what you consider to be the main points from your point of view.
Well, I think the main point really is that family of polity is a useful concept that is often either overlooked completely in a lot of native title anthropology, or it's paid kind of lip service, where there's like a mention, oh, these are families of polity, and then people move on without really exploring the dynamics. I have not encountered what you've said. Like, it's kind of the opposite almost, where you said people say, oh, they've got families of polity, so that's it. That's the system of law and custom. I've not encountered that. It's definitely, that would be I would agree that that's, it's insufficient. Like it's just a analytical tool really that allows us to dig into the social complexities of a group of people and try and find patterns and so on. But we are still left, our task in the native title anthropology is still to find the continuity of law and custom in its contemporary form. And I see families of polity as just one other analytical tool towards that end.
Yeah, and I think we're in sort of agreement on this. I think it's a useful model because it's at the right sort of scale, and it very often approximates what you find in the field, but it does need local specification, I think. And we still need, as you suggested, to demonstrate that the claimants are still following norms relating to land and that they're part of a sort of wider group that share those norms. Yeah, definitely worth being in the toolkit of any consultant anthropologist.